Thank everyone for coming out today. This is a program we've been wanting to do for quite some time. And just a little note here, we have some sagas from the Genealogy Society of Southern Illinois, the copies up here that are free. If somebody wants one, they can have it. Over here we have some photos that are from French's, and they can reproduce these for you for $10 if you would like that. So they're always a good source to go to if you want some history photos of the Herrin. I mean, they got books you can look through, so always remember that and advertise that around. We have some a few articles and some other photos and stuff that's been brought in that's not to go out. It belongs to people, but they will talk about it whenever they get a chance. If you didn't sign in, make sure you do. We have to give a count for using this room each time. We had a wonderful Christmas program in here, and it turned out it was just us, the members. The room was full, and my goodness, we had everybody in the room gave a little talk. Chris, it was just amazing. I've had so many people stop me in town since I was there saying what a great time it was. And after that, I want to introduce our PR chairman, Cheryl Trench, and she's going to come up here and kind of take over here. I'm just up here, I'm the president, and I'll help out if I get asked, but there's going to be more people sitting back here that's going to know more than the people up here. And this is also going to be a chime-in thing, because this is how we all learn, is hearing what other people recollect.
Thank you,
Cheryl.
Phil. Before we actually begin our program, we wanted to have, it's the new year, and we have lost 3 of our very wonderful members of HAHS, and then I have a bit of other news for you as well. But we did want to pause just for 30 seconds. Clifton Brown was one of our members who is deceased. Joe Mazer, who was a board member earlier in 2012, died. And most recently, and he was just in this room in December, and our president mentioned about how well-spoken he was and what he shared with us in the middle of December, and that was Jack Odom, who died earlier this month. So we mourn the loss of all 3 of them. They were certainly wonderful assets to our group. The other notification that I just had in the last hour, Mike Murphy called me from Custom Tours and Travel, and you know, one of our sportscasters, and he had just been notified by Herrin High School that Coach Earl Lee, who was able to come and be with us in September and made a journey to be with his players, he died on Wednesday, just a couple of days ago, in Columbia at the nursing home where he was. If you want to know more about it, he's at Braun, B-R-A-U-N, Funeral Home in Columbia, Illinois. And you can Google that on your internet if you need to find out any other information. It's our understanding that there's no real service, that there is a visitation with his 3 daughters. His wife is still living, but she's also been in another nursing home. So let's just pause for 30 seconds for those people that I have just mentioned. Thank you. Today are the Herrin Auto Dealers, and from the 20th century. We have many people up here, and we have one right back there by Attorney Brandon. If you would like to come up here, and once you took your hat off, I knew exactly who you were. Bill James from Launch Motors. So we have a chair for him. You can sit right here. Yeah.
Also, we have refreshments in the back, and anyone can get up and go get anything if you want.
How you doing, Uncle Rudolph? I met you a while ago.
So, I'm going to just introduce very quickly who's sitting here in front of you, but as Philip said, it's going to be a conversation. I mean, I have stories to tell about Brewster Motors from 1965. So who we have with us today is Mary D'Amico. She was a longtime employee of Brewster Motors. So I'm sure that she and John Brewster, who's right next to her, is the son of the owner, Clyde Brewster. We're very appreciative that he could come, his parents, Clyde and Stevie. And maybe he'll tell us about his first Ford that he got for his family. Next to him is Nancy Jack Gravalia, and her uncle was John Bedino. Her mother and Marie Bedino were sisters. And Nancy was just saying how John wanted to spoil her all the time, but her parents, we all remember Mr. Jack and Mrs. Jack, and they didn't much allow that. We also have the Perota couple who both worked for Brewster Motors, and I'm sure they have stories to tell us as well. And then the gentleman who came in with his hat, and I didn't recognize him, Claunch Motors, Bill James, and he looks very fine, doesn't he? All of them do. We're very pleased that they could all join us. Emmeline Wilcox is sitting in the front row. Her husband was a salesman. She has a fabulous, handsome picture of her husband. And she can share that too. So every man that came in today, I was asking Tom Gorski and Pastor Brandon, did you ever work for any of the car dealers? None of them did, but they're here because they're interested. So I'm going to begin with my little story, and then we'll start right there with Mary. In 1965, my father said if I graduated from college, really, I was going to. It wasn't as if I wouldn't. But anyway, I got a 1965, and we have Vi Parsons from Parsons Oldsmobile. So we'll let Vi get up here too. I was enamored of the new Mustangs, and I was given one when I graduated from college. I had it for 3 months. I was recently married. I lived at 508 North 13th. Diane Eliani Hammond, has a younger brother. My beautiful pale green Mustang was on North 13th, 508 North 13th. Parked, going north. Mr. Eliani, that little devil rascal, we were having dinner, my husband and I. He hit the Mustang, and it went flying down the block. It was totaled. So my dad trots out and talks to Clyde Brewster, and I thought, oh my God, little Clyde. And Clyde Brewster, he was really good, and I've never forgotten that, John, because he could have just said, you know, give the insurance or whatever. He took that little battered, 3-month-old new 65 Mustang, and he gave me another one. I kept that car till 1998. It had 31,000 miles on it. I never should have sold it, and I sold it to a guy in Murfreesboro for $5,000. And I regretted it ever since then. I still have the keys, and I have the original title. So that's my Mustang story. So Mary D'Amico, tell us about your memory of working for Clyde Brewster and some of the salesmen.
Well, I worked there as a bookkeeper for 16 years, and I babysat this thing. Whenever,
some things never change.
and I'll let him take over. I was just kept books.
Who was the most flamboyant salesman that you remember at Brewster Motors?
Well, Jimmy Feaster.
Flamboyant, right.
I think he sold the most cars of anybody.
Actually, I think Pat McGee came along
Yeah.
and eclipsed Jim's
Back
performance
then.
because Jim obviously, died at an untimely death. But Pat McGee kind of worked in Jim's shadow, but he was very good at what he did, and became once Jim was no longer there, really blossomed and was quite a salesperson. Did very well.
John, was it just Fords that your father sold at that location?
Just Ford Mercury at that location. Over the years, my dad got involved in various other dealerships. Started Marion Motors, which is now changed hands 2 or 3 times, and was also had an Edsel dealership in Marion with Joe Hatsagi, one of the original folks involved in the dealership, and then they also had one in Harrisburg. And I think Joe at one time actually went out on his own. My dad had an interest in a dealership down in Mounds, 6 or 7 of them at one time. Let me back up. I think actually Edsel was in Herrin on Monroe Street, kind of where my dad started.
How did the Edsel go? How long did the Edsel last?
Not very long.
Not very long. Maybe 2 or 3 years at max. It was kind of like a Saturn, but it didn't last nearly as long. Ill-fated adventure.
Mary, tell them a story about the fancy car with all the chrome and the little man that came up. She's told me something.
We had, back then, like every couple of years, they would have a car that it'd be entirely redone. And they had this black Ford, but everything was chrome, no plastic back then. And I'll never forget that on the side, they had a mirror, but it was shaped like a big globe, and it was chrome. And all these people were milling around looking at this car and everything, but there was this little old man there, and you could tell he was a farmer. No socks, dirty shoes and everything. No one looked at him all day long. They just kept looking at everything else. And before the end of the day, he went up to Brewster and he said, I want to buy that car. And he paid cash for it. And Brewster always told us, I don't care who comes in here, how they're dressed, or what they look like, you treat everyone alike. And he said, and that's an example right there. And he said, and if you recognize anybody, you call them by name. So one day this lady come in and I said, may I help you, Mrs. McGee? She said, the name's McGinnis. I don't remember that. I think he wanted us to treat everybody alike, no matter how they were dressed or anything.
Mary, if you don't mind telling us, what was your wage, your hourly wage?
I didn't hear.
Wage, how much were you paid?
Oh, I forget. But I remember one day I went in there and I said, I've never done this before, boss, but I think I need a raise. He said, well, I was just wondering when you were going to ask for one. And I said, well, I thought you thought I was good enough that you would give it to me without asking for it. But I forget now exactly how much it was, but I thought I was really getting paid a lot.
Yeah.
And then one day, it was real funny, I was telling Johnny the story. We never called him Clyde. Nobody ever called him Clyde. They either called him Boss, Mr. B, or Mr. Brewster. And this guy come in and he said, is Clyde here? And Jimmy Feaser happened to be there and he said, Clyde? And so I said, no, he's gone uptown, have coffee, but if you wait around a while, he'll come back in a little while. And he said, no, just tell him I remember when he ate hamburgers. So when Brewster come back, he said, was anybody looking for me while I was gone, Mary? And I said, some guy come in here and he said to tell you, he remembers you when you ate hamburgers. He said, well, if he comes back, tell him I'm still eating.
So tell us what the Perotas did for the Brewsters,
Oh,
Brewster Motors. Tell us about you two.
I worked along with Mary in the office. I done mostly, I think, accounts receivable and typed up the deals and typed up the contracts and took care of the license and title and all such stuff as that. And in those days, turn signals were not automatically on the car. If you wanted them, you had to order them separately. So they were considered added equipment, and they cost $15 at that time. Your radio was added equipment, and there was no air conditioning and different things like that. And I worked there I wasn't out of high school yet. I started in April of '52 and worked there till about August of '62. And we just worked along together, and Mr. Brewster was really a nice, very nice person to work for, and everything was really casual, but like she said, you called him either Mr. B or Brewster or Boss or just anything like that. And that is where I met my husband, Rudy, husband-to-be, Rudy. He was working out in the service station at the time because he had a Sinclair gas station out there, and that's where Rudy was working. Well, after a couple of years, we started dating, and we married in 1957. That was the year he became a journeyman mechanic. And he worked there also till about 1962, 1963. And he landed up retiring from where Bill James worked. That's why he calls him Uncle Rudolph. But that's how he got his start in mechanicing, and he also worked at HAHS Chevrolet. And he worked at Narge, like everybody seemed to land up at one time or another at Narge. And then he went to Vernell Cellars, and then he landed up at Clonches and spent 20-some odd years at Clonches. But he could take a carburetor apart, blindfolded, I think, and put it back together, and the car would run perfect after that. And we were at McDonald's the other day, and we were leaving, and there was a couple gentlemen sitting in the back. And as we were walking out, this one man that was sitting said, "Oh, there's the mechanic for Roosters." And that was him. And he's been recognized for working at Roosters for more than the other places. But to remember him from back from 1952 or 62, I mean, people had a good memory.
And he looks good, so he hasn't changed much.
John, did your family want you to go into we have an attorney, that's what he chose for his career. Did you ever consider,
I did, when I was in grad school at Illinois, I went to the, Ford had these programs that if you wanted to be a dealer and your family was in the business, you had to go through these schools, they called them, and I did a couple of those up in Chicago. They were like, I think one was 2 weeks, the other was a month at a time, and came back and did various things, and I had worked in the wash rack and I think about as far up the chain, the food chain as I got was an assistant in the service department, which was that's the place, as anybody who works in service will testify, you'll make or break a dealership, because cars always something wrong with them. And people would come in and you had to listen to them and try to understand and try to solve their problems. But I guess I'm a little bit like Abe Lincoln in that respect. That's too much like real work, so I decided it's time to go to law school and be a lawyer. I think the Lincoln story was that he discovered that on the end of a hole out in the garden, and Dad was pretty tough and telling him what to do, and he decided, well, he better do something else, otherwise he's going to be on that hole for the rest of his life.
John, did your father, was he an award-winning Ford dealer? I think I've heard that.
I think, yes, but probably more, and he'd probably say the same thing, more was based on just the survival, being in the business for a long time. He and his friend Tommy Tomlinson from West Frankfort, who was a much more colorful character than my father, started in the business about the same time in the mid-30s. And then Tom went off and fought in World War II, and then also in the Korean War. He was on MacArthur's staff. But my dad had fought in World War I, and he decided that war was more than one war was enough. But in any case, they started together, and I was reading some of this when this is what they call the St. Louis region, and when my dad started, there were only maybe half a dozen dealerships. And then mid-60s, there were a couple of hundred. But he got involved in a lot of organizations with the Ford Motor Company that brought you in contact with the other dealers. I remember growing up, I got to know Dave Sinclair. Anybody that's been around the St. Louis area knows that Dave Sinclair, he was a St. Louis cop who got out of the cop business and became one of the nation's best-selling Ford dealers. And he just passed away here less than partly a year ago. And his boys have all gone, they've got various dealerships all over St. Louis, fabulously successful. But Dave was just starting out, and my dad really took a fancy to Dave and could tell that he was going to be something special in the business, and they became good friends, and so knew him throughout his life. And met a lot of fascinating people that way. Car dealers are generally an interesting lot. I mean, you've got to have you've got to be a little carnival in you and a little bit of a huckster, and I mean, you're trading. And the car business is based on, most important, Mr. Davis say, this is how you value those used cars. And because if you're not accurate on valuing the used cars, I mean, you're not going to last very long in the car business at all. And so it was an interesting experience. I learned a great deal, but obviously chose a different path.
Well, right next to John, and just because we closed down, one part, we can certainly bring up other things. Sam?
I wanted to talk about
Go
some
ahead.
of those colorful people that work for Clyde Brewster. And Jimmy Feaster is one. I think most anybody lived around Herrin very long knew Jimmy. But one of Jimmy's favorite tricks right after the war, Jimmy started working down there. He would work the Herrin Supply first, and Jimmy was selling clothing for Herrin Supply, and Jimmy would be out of town. You walk in, he'd try to sell you everything in the store. He'd sell the tie right off. He'd take it right off and sell you that tie right there. Any way to make a sale. So it wasn't long after that he started working at Brewster's down there. And Jimmy got to be the top salesman for a couple of years in a row in this whole St. Louis district, everybody. And the way Jimmy used to do that, Jimmy was athletic. He used to box the Golden Gloves, and he played on the 1940 basketball team that went to state and got second. And he was a really interesting person. And he used to line up down there, and if a guy came by in the city, Jimmy would pull him over and he'd say, I tell you what, anybody has to drive that piece of junk like that, you shouldn't be driving, you need a Ford. He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. The railroad track was right there, the cube track. He said, I'll race you in that car. You run your car and I'll race you, and I bet I'll beat you to the tracks. He would. He'd run, and that guy would take off running every time. Of course, he'd get beat, but he got his point over. So that's the way Jimmy was. He'd do anything to make a sale.
You're right.
He'd do anything. If you came to see him once, I'll tell you, that car at 5 o'clock at night, he was down there in it at your house in front and revving the motor up a little bit. Listen to that motor now, listen to that motor. And he was going to sell. So Jimmy put a lot of color in that. And I know they were starting to build right across the street from our lumber yard, the 400 block North Park there. They built that, it was Kroger, I guess, put in there. Leany boy had built the store. And a couple of the guys over there that were laying brick, there was always water down there in summer, water hanging in the ditch there, they were mixing mortar and all this stuff. So I can't think of the guy's name. One of the guys that probably a lot of you would know, he was hod carrying down there. So Jimmy would come down from the street up at the church, or up at the station and going south. And that big puddle of water, he'd come up and he'd cut in and cut that water, just spray all those guys. They'd wait and throw bricks at him next time he came through. But he'd come by and spray all those guys along the wall there and burn it out there, and then he did it twice to them one day. And then they quit work and just waited for him with brick bats. He never came back. He never came back that day. So Jimmy always kept things going in the town. Another thing about the dealership, the old dealership's right where the city hall sits today, right in the middle of the block. And you had to drive in around there and come back out. Well, in about 34, 35, Bonnie and Clyde, the famous gangsters, where they shot them about 50 times, I think, with machine guns in that car. They had that car. They'd bring those gangster cars in town, and Clyde had that car parked there one day with all the bullet holes, the blood stains, and everything in that car was there. So everybody in town went by to see that car of Bonnie and Clyde's, that famous gangsters that they had. So that was an interesting thing. Then later they built it right after the war, 47, 48, seemed like right in there. As the first building, I think, in town a building, a business building that's built from back in the Depression times. Because there was, of course, the war, you couldn't build anything during the war from 41 till 46. You couldn't get any material to build. And so they built that first building right there, which was really something. They had curved glass on that, and that was really getting uptown with that new building down there to spruce up that corner. So that was a good time to see all these things and how they grew and really got them. Herrin started growing good in about 47, right after the war. The guys were all home and doing those things. But I had a little connection there. My son-in-law worked for Ford for 28 years. He worked with Edsel Ford for about 4 years. He was one of the younger sons named Edsel Ford, and he worked the office there in Detroit, at the main office there for 2 or 3 years that he was there and worked for Ford Motors. So he knew all the people. In fact, he told me the president of the general manager and CEO of Ford Motors today, that man, I can't think of his name, used to work for him in the office. He was in the marketing division of the company. So we're well informed, but Ford Motors has been a part of our life ever since.
For a long time. All right, next to John is Nancy Jackalonga, and she is the heir, relative, probably a better way of saying it, a niece to John Bedino. And she has a wonderful little piece over there too. I wanted to get that and show it to us. And there are wonderful pictures that John Brewster has brought, as well as Nancy, with regard to both Bedino and Brewster. So Nancy, tell us about John Bedino. And he was right telling the location.
Well, I wanted to say first, my son is now in Brewster, because I'm glad he didn't tear it down like so many things get torn down. And I'm glad he renovated it. And I was amazed when I went in at all the little cubbies that are back in there. That it's really bigger than.
When I was a kid, there were a lot of places to hide.
Oh, that's what his son does now. Yeah, his son has a lot of fun going in there. But the best article I found was written by Miss Cheryl in 1978 about my uncle. Do you remember Cheryl in the Observer?
Yeah, I remember
I don't
interviewing
even
various
remember.
people.
The Observer.
It was the Christopher Observer, and they did the Herrin spokesman.
Oh, well, this article was excellent. I said it said anything that I would want to say about my uncle. It was very complimentary, and he was an uncle that every girl would love to have had. And he was quiet, but yet he was very well respected, and he was born in Gallup, New Mexico, and he came to Herrin the way I got it, because it said he had a 6th grade education, and he entered the coal mines at $1.25 a day, and he worked right alongside his dad, who was a machinist at Madison 8. Is that out?
Clifford 8, yeah, right up
Clifford.
north.
Yeah.
About a
In
mile.
Dumaine.
Yeah,
And,
back towards Carterville, right there to Carterville.
His dad made surgical tools for a physician here in Herrin, and so Uncle John learned the machinist trade from that, and then started a machine shop, and then did so well at that he started the Buick garage in 1928. And it said the Depression then came at that time, and but General Motors had not forgotten. It was kind of like just a machine shop, the way I got it. He didn't sell Buicks yet. And so then the Depression swept in, and General Motors had not forgotten John Bedino, and they came by, and this was in 1938. It said this man came by who was a zone manager and took off his coat, laid it on a chair, and said, "I'm not leaving until I sign you on as a Buick dealer." And he says, "You've got the service, the parts, and the goodwill to be a fine dealer." And he did that for 50 years here in Herrin, and then some people from Benton by the name of O'Sullivan bought it from him, and I don't think they did very well with it.
It was downhill from there.
It was downhill, right. But there are some really good pictures, and I thought it was interesting that his parents were Italians, and he was born, like I said, in Gallup, New Mexico, one of 5 children. He had a sister, Marie Dawson, that some of you might remember.
He had another sister.
Frances.
Francis lived in Christopher,
Right.
and his daughter, her daughter,
Oh, Pat.
Pat, yes,
Uh-huh.
years ago.
Pat Bearden.
And, yeah, Bearden was her name.
You dated her?
Mhm. Yeah,
She's still alive, I think.
I don't know. I haven't
Lives
heard anything
in
years.
Florida, I believe.
In Florida, last I heard she was in Minnesota, she was a nurse and married a doctor.
Right.
Yeah,
was in
and he was
Minnesota.
ill, and they had to move to Marco Island.
Now Nancy, tell us about John's wife though, because she was, just
She was
as
big in
Stevie
Girl
Brewster
Scouts.
was very active in the community.
Marie, she was my mom's sister, and she was very active in our church, First Baptist Church, and Girl Scouting, she and Julia Bruce, and, let's see, I think it tells,
Junior Woman's Club.
oh, Junior Women's Club?
She ran it for years.
I didn't know that. I knew she was involved in it, but I didn't know she.
Junior Women's Club.
Here, it said, Julia Bruce and Paul McCaslin started the Girl Scouts in Herrin. I didn't know that, and he was the Baptist minister. Uh-huh.
Came in about 44 or something like that.
Cheryl, you got a lot of good information in
I'm
here.
glad it's written down so we can remember.
Oh, and he told, do you remember Homer Mitchell? He
Yes.
had the
The printing.
newspaper right across the street from him, and the bakery,
Town bakery.
Town bakery.
town, Pernago. Anyway, they all just had a great time talking and hanging out at Uncle John's. Well, Homer Mitchell evidently said that he and Uncle John were just like brothers. He said, when I'd have trouble in my news shop, I could always walk over and get encouragement from John. And this is what Homer said. One time, Uncle John did something to him that was kind of funny. He said, I had just bought a watermelon from the ice boy on a hot summer day. And Bedino walked through my shop and stole it 15 minutes later. And then went over there and then sent one of his guys that worked in the shop over to invite Homer over to have watermelon with him. But he did tricks like that all the time. He used to do it on us, and every year he would get me one of my kids have played with this. It's a bank, a Buick. And this one is the best looking one of all I have left. But we used to play with it. Gail, I don't know if you played with me.
Probably.
Out in the dirt at our house, because Gail was my childhood friend on North 9th Street, and he would always have money in this for us. And so then when my kids came along, they played with them, and I kept some of them. But anyway, there were a lot of fun times. I remember as a little girl, Uncle John would go to St. Louis to pick up cars. And my mother and my aunt would get to ride along, and we would get all dressed up, and he would drop us off, and we would shop. And then my aunt would drive the car we came up in home, and he'd drive the new car for somebody that had, bought one down here. And we'd do that a lot. And I told Gail they'd always have gloves on, my mom and my aunt.
Yeah, when you went to the city.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of fun times.
Now, where was the dealership located?
It's, you know where the Casey's is now? 16?
Yeah.
16th Street. Yeah, you would recognize, here's a picture. Every year for the yearbook in high school, he would let us,
Right in that.
220.
yeah, you probably were.
North.
I'm driving in this one, and Sheila Marlowe, and Loretta Gapjera, and Diane Hammond are in there, and Barbara Gerke. And Cheryl?
daughter's
Yeah.
father died, you know.
Yes, she did.
Where they used to-
That was the coolest yearbook. Some of us who are, if you're from the 60s and the late 50s, the Badino Buick ad was always just fabulous. I always wanted to be in a convertible, I never was.
Some of them,
But
here's
North
another one.
16th
Now
is,
this
you know where the
was-
big Eagles Lodge, and then there's a house, and then there's the KC Hall, and Badino was at the
And
end.
this is, there it is.
It's not part of the KC building.
Right, this is part of the KC.
That's the corner.
And this gal that's driving it, her dad had bought her this car for her senior graduation. Her name was Marcella Getchman, and some of you might remember Johnny, her brother, and the Getchmans, and Gail and I were talking. We used to go paint. And they had,
Yeah.
did this
You talked about it the other day.
Diane Kelly and I did that one.
oh, did you? And this, I laughed because Uncle John didn't have any secretaries. Every Sunday night, this is what, he did statements in the kitchen. And I wasn't supposed to bother him then, because he and my aunt would sit there and do the statements. He never had a secretary. No computer, none of that stuff, so. And he did all his bookwork himself. And then he was, here's a nice picture.
Mary, that would be true at Brewster too. Can you hear me, Mary? It was all by hand, or were you using typewriters?
Council.
We did it by hand.
By hand, right?
Ledger stuff.
We had a ledger and a journal, and we did do the double entry, and we have to balance out the printing.
Yeah. Some of you know, here's somebody else you might know. This fella, Gene Grau, some of you remember him. He worked for him. And Charlie Nava, remember Charlie? His daughter is still alive, Joyce Nava. Here's Charlie, the arts department.
Yeah, Gene was there for,
And he was there.
Jerry Bailey was there for a while.
Jerry
And
worked
he was
for
down
him.
at the launches too, wasn't he, Gene Brown?
Yeah.
She's the driver.
Charlie Nava was there forever.
Sometimes you forget some of these names and then you hear.
Right, until you hear them.
Yeah.
when did the Ford dealership close and when did the Buick dealership close?
Ford closed out on where Offenburg is now, probably about 10, within the last 10 years.
Okay, so it moved out there?
Yes.
Okay.
My dad sold to Frank Blyer. Frank Blyer bought that for his son, and then they sold to John Carthen and Ed Rothenberger, which it became Lakeland Ford, and moved out to, they built it. Carthen and Rothenberger built the new dealership, and then they sold to, it might even been closed. I think they sold the building to Offenburg, and it was no longer, yeah, they were obviously closed, because the Ford franchise went away.
Yeah.
And it's the Dodge Chrysler products now.
Offenburger doesn't have any Ford dealerships?
Offenburg, Offenburg's got dealerships
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah.
But they're,
Well, they're not in this area.
yeah, there are different I mean, there are that's a family of folks in that
So it's not all
business.
one person?
Yeah, they're up in the Metro East there along 64. This fellow's Chris Offenburg, and he's got a facility, maybe a couple of facilities. in
His facilities is all to the south and over into southern Missouri. His brother is up at St. Louis.
Is that the fair, St. Louis? And,
Yeah.
yeah.
Kings Highway, south Kings.
Which seems to
Highway.
be the trend in the automobile business, is these dealers have lots of dealerships, all different. I mean, you see, well, like Foley, what used to be Foley Schweitzer is now Chevrolet, Cadillac, Mercedes-Benz, Buick, GMC, all is basically under the same, it doesn't seem to make any, I've not yet seen a Ford and Chevrolet together in the same building, but,
So it would be difficult for a person to start a Ford dealership or a Buick dealership by themselves now. It would have to be a big
I'd say it'd be nigh on
organization.
impossible
Yeah.
right now, because, I mean, they're constant, this is what I've learned over the years, and not necessarily in the automotive industry, but the companies, Ford, Chevrolet, GM, their relationship with their dealers is not always that pleasant. They're big companies and they conduct themselves accordingly. And there are laws that have been passed both at state and federal level to protect franchisee, the dealers, from the ability and the power of the companies to just shut them down by not giving them product. You know, there are all sorts of rules they have. Otherwise, I don't believe that the dealership system as we see in this country would even exist today. They'd all be owned by the companies themselves. They wouldn't have any, they wouldn't allow independent dealers.
I had some dealings with Ford Motor in Dearborn back in the late 70s when there was a gasoline shortage. You remember when the highways had to go down to 55 miles per hour? Well, the company I was working for made little slide rules and product demonstrations and so on. And so we came up with the idea, well, how far can you go on a weekend trip on one tank of gasoline? So we made a little slide rule that had the gasoline mileage, so you could figure your mileage. And if you got 15 miles per gallon and your gasoline tank holds 18 gallons, you can go so many miles, you know. Or say it holds 20 gallons and 15 miles per gallon, you could go, what, 300 miles, round trip. And we even had it on there so that you can say, well, you can go 150 miles, but then you got to turn around and come back on that tank of gas. And it had a little flap on it, and the Ford dealer, it was made for Ford, had a place for his business card to be stuck in there. So he could give that away to his customers.
Yeah, nice. Super.
And that was the biggest sale I had ever made.
Oh.
We sold almost 1 million of those slide rules, little paper slide rules.
Nobody knew how to multiply.
In America. All right, we're going to move because we spoke with Mr. and Mrs. Perota. This is Bill James. He was one of Herrin's very excellent salesmen too. And he worked for Clunch Motors. And just tell us your memories and wherever else you worked.
Well, my memories goes back in 1955. I started working here on the first day of January 1955 in was old Pontiac. The automobile business in Herrin depended primarily and basically on two people, Oakley Hayes and Clyde Brewster. Clyde had what a few of the people used to say, his boys, people that had worked for him and then went on to become their own dealers. In the late 1930s, Walter Williamson, Blackbird, Joe Bensoggy, Fred Clunch, all worked for Clyde Brewster in wash rack and the service department and parts department. After their tours of duty in the military and what have you, Fred went to work for Charlie Mazzot, his father-in-law. Blackbird stayed with Clyde and worked at a dealership and ran a dealership and then had his own dealerships. Walter Williamson stayed with Clyde and everything. And Walter had to probably have the next thing to being a saint that you could be, because he put up with Jim for all those years, and Jim would tell, was a friend of mine, nice guy. We got along great. He would tell people anything. He'd tell them anything. Get in the office, he'd tell Walter what he told him. Walter would say, "Now, Jim, you know we can't do that." They'd finally get it negotiated out. Jim had another sale. Jim sold a lot of cars. But Oakley Hayes was the same way as Clyde. He and Clyde were both gentlemen. That's just all you can say about it. They were gentlemen. Oakley back in the 30s had two super duper salesmen. They both went on to be in business for themselves after working for Oakley, but he always thought kindly of them. That was Charlie Mazzone and Carl Parsons. Carl went on to be the Oldsmobile dealer. He bought out Mr. Kirkpatrick in, must have been 1958. Seven? That's okay. All right. He bought out Mr. Kirkpatrick, who had been the old dealer there, which was right across the street from City Hall, where City Hall is now. And where that building was, and the first building south was A&P store. Frank Calcaterra, manager, ran it. And then the next building south was old Pontiac. We had Pontiac there until Charlie died in 1961. At that time, General Motors had come up with another new plan. Someone mentioned just a while ago that their big automobile companies are difficult to deal with. Irregardless of how good a dealer, how out a dealer or whatnot, they're difficult to deal with. They had come up with a deal in 1961 and 62 along in there that unless a town was really large, which Herrin wasn't, or nothing else in southern Illinois was, there would be no more single franchises awarded. So at that time, the old Pontiac was probably the strongest Pontiac dealer in southern Illinois. But either somebody to have Pontiac would either have to get John to sell him Buick or Carl to sell him Oldsmobile, or Carl or John, one or the other, to ask for the Pontiac franchise. Well, neither one of them wanted to, because they would have to buy additional signs, additional parts, additional special tools, double their inventory. So as a result, while Pontiac was no longer sold in Herrin after 1961, that was the last year of it. We opened up Clonch Motors the first day of January 1962. I don't know if it was distinguishable or a yes or no or bad or indifferent. I was the first employee and the last employee. 38 years and 10 months. Some of the things that I noticed about the little article I saw in the papers, how come you come today, some of the dealerships that hadn't been mentioned, down on the corner of the intersection, you know, across from where your dad's dealership was there and everything, before he actually had that building done, Bill Burke had Kaiser Freighter.
What was it called, Bill?
And as you come on up the street just a little bit and what have you, well, you got the HAHS Chevrolet sitting there on the east side. Keep coming up the street a little bit on the same way and everything, you got up to Car Motors. And across the street is where the old Pontiac started, across the street from Car Motors. Then later on, while they, after 2 or 3 years down there at the old 333 station, they moved up to the building that they ended up in. Then, of course, Brewster Motors is where City Hall is now. Right behind where we were there at Clonch Motors, and on the corner of the side street there was Mike Spacey, had Nash. And just half a block behind him was John Bedino, of course. Then we went back to Park Avenue and started down Park Avenue, where the furniture store is now, was Kenny Davis. Kenny had Dodge and Plymouth. Eddie Carr had Chrysler and Plymouth. And at one time they had Edsel, where it was located down on the side street there. And well, I think Blackbird ran it while it was there, didn't he?
But that's actually, as I at least reading this article, though, before my time, that's where my dad started, that was his first.
Right.
That was, it was a garage, it wasn't a dealership, but I think they sold
When
tractors.
I came to Herrin, though, which was in, let's say January 1, 55, well, just thinking back of the ones that were and everything, it's the best of my knowledge, Herrin never had but 9 dealerships operating at any one time. They had more dealerships than that operated at any one time. I think 9 was all there had.
It says here that Bob Brewster, my dad, and they had Ford, Plymouth, and DeSoto. But my dad became a Ford dealer where City Hall is now in 35.
An interesting thing about Davis Motor Sales, Kenny Davis, Kenny's dad had Davis Ford in Marion before your dad was the Ford dealer in Marion. And Kenny had the distinction of being the youngest Ford dealer, as far as I know, that there ever was in the United States. He was a Ford dealer in Carterville at age 16. The dealership was, as you go into Carpendale, into Carterville, and there by the post office and where the banks and stuff is and everything, turn right down the main street, and just a building or two is where the Ford dealership was on the right-hand side.
When would have that been back?
That would have been back in the 30s. And, well, I guess he still had it in the, early 40s too.
Who was the dealer?
Kenny Davis.
Davis
Motors,
Davis
Kenny.
Brothers.
Wes Hayton had a dealership in Carterville.
Wes had Oldsmobile.
Oldsmobile, okay.
He had Oldsmobile in Carterville, and he had Oldsmobile in Marion.
And then Holmes had something, didn't he? George Holmes?
I really don't know.
I mean, he had the fire station for a long time. He was the fire chief. But
Yeah.
I think he had an automotive dealership of some sort.
Carterville?
That's what I think, yeah.
Bill,
Oh, no, I
how
know
did
he's
people
part of it.
pay for their cars? Did you finance cars? How did they pay
Oh,
for
boy,
it?
that was something other else back then, In 1955, we had the Bank of Herrin. Naturally, all the dealerships in town done business with the Bank of Herrin, but that was their own personal business. The Bank of Herrin financed very, very few cars. They wasn't interested really in the automobile business. The 2 big automobile financing things that we had operating were both located in Carpendale. Universal CIT and GMAC. They both had large offices over there for that period of time. Each one of them had roughly 15 employees, and they financed the automobiles primarily that was sold here in Southern Illinois.
I was thinking back, whenever we moved from the old building to the new building where I worked at Brewster's, across the street, and I can't remember, but Paul Hyman had a garage there. And I can't remember if he sold Nash or there was something. And I couldn't remember if it was,
It was Owens and Gill.
It was
sold
about-
I think the name of the dealership was Owens and Gill. And they sold Nash's.
they sold Nash's. And
That's before
I thought, I wonder why
Spazier.
people never
Yeah,
mention it. 'Cause-
they were before Mike Spavey.
Yeah.
They were
Well,
before.
Charles Helene called this morning and was unable to be here, and that was one he wanted to call our attention to,
See,
Owens
Marilyn, there
Motors,
was a
across
dealership
from
there.
Bruce.
I could remember, because I knew that
That's what I was
hotel
just
was
gonna-
there all the time.
When Bill was
talking
going
about
down
how-
Park
How
Avenue,
people,
I was gonna wait till there was a little lull in here and I was gonna bring that one up. So
Yeah.
that's what it was. I noticed that one, and I think there was another one that wasn't in the paper too, but I can't remember now what.
The ones that we know that we didn't mention are Davis Brothers, which you're all alluding to, Mazzo Pontiac, Lakeland Ford, Owens Motors. That's the
Yeah, that was
other.
Owens and Gill.
There's
Leon made
And do you
me a
even
li-
have some
He
more?
got a
He gave
list.
me a list.
We would like to make a comment
Mary.
about that.
There would be the list that would know.
Right.
We go way back.
Yes.
Because I guess Leon is probably the oldest person left living who worked in the automobile business in Herrin.
Yes, I wish he could have come.
Right,
to-
it would have
He's
Yeah, I wish
got,
he could have too.
he's blind in a wheelchair, but he can remember
Remember
all these
everything.
things. And there was a George Brown, that
Right,
one,
that had Brown Pontiac before it was over.
I don't remember.
he's the one that, he even knew which cars they sold, which dealerships they were.
All right, we're going to move on from our list here, and then, of course, we're all going to have a chance to speak. This is Vi Parsons. She's the widow of Carl Parsons, and it was very nice to hear him speak very highly of your husband, isn't it? And your father and your uncle, and it makes us all proud of what went on here in the 20th century. So Vi, Junior was the quietest man. That's what I remember. Is that true?
Yeah.
And he sold fabulous Oldsmobiles. I know we bought a number of those. What are your memories of that?
Well, we came in Herrin in '57. We were in Springfield, and Mr. Parsons wanted the dealership, but they wouldn't give it to him because he was an older man. So they had to get somebody younger to be with him. So he talked Carl Jr. into coming. So we moved here in '57. And the garage was right across from the city hall. I think there's a parts place there now.
Yes,
And of course, A&P was next door, and then was old
right.
on down there. So, and then we were there for quite a while. And then they built a new building north of town. And
And what is in there now, Vi? Is that Ron Ward's body
Ron Ward's
shop?
body shop.
Ron Ward bought the dealership, and we moved, they built a new building, we moved out there, and we were there for, well, about 14, 15 years. And then, of course, he passed away in '89, and the dealership was sold to Ron Ward.
How many salesmen did Mr. Parsons have, did your husband have?
Well, with Mr. Parsons, of course, he was in the car business all the time anyway. He had a used car lot there by the hospital
Yep.
for many years. And there was Carl Jr. and Carl and Benny G.
Was that next to Tony's? Was that on the corner?
My husband said if she's
Right next
there.
to Tony's,
Where
right,
you-
their
That's
car lot.
what he remembered, Parsons
Chevy
having
used
a
to
used
go.
car lot there next to
Yeah.
Tony's.
Right next to Tony's.
And
Yep.
there was the best little restaurant right next door.
It was
Tony's.
Tony's.
Kalar,
Yeah,
Yes.
that's Tony's place.
Right next to
It was.
Tony's there.
right next door.
Yeah, Carl.
Right next, but
Carl Senior had that lot for a long time.
forgotten that one.
And he said that Dr. Miller used to come over there and take off from the hospital and go there and get away from everything.
Yeah.
So they had a pretty good time.
His dad used to live over there too.
Are we all remembering this restaurant? Because I hear them talking about it. It's right where Sheffer Insurance is, on the corner. It had great hamburgers. How many of you ate there? I remember many of
Second
us.
floor.
Yeah, it was good. Vi, we're going to step here to Emmeline because your husband worked for Brewster Motor before we
No,
go.
he worked for Mazzo
Mazzo
Pontiac and
Pontiac.
Hard Motors.
All right, that's it. Well, you mention some things.
I wish he could have come,
Going chair.
pardon me, I wish he could have come and talked to you about it. He's in bad shape physically, but his mind is sharp. He could tell me everything that happened. After we came back from World War II, he took a job that he wasn't very happy with because, well, there just wasn't much here at the time till he got going. And then he got a job called Fred Hodge, asked him to come to work for Mazzo Pontiac. But I want to tell you about Mazzo Pontiac first. We were in Arizona for 2 years while he was in service. And we had a 35 Ford V8 that he drove out the desert every day And we drove home. I don't remember if it's once or twice in it, but anyway, the last time we drove home in it, we went to Charlie Mazzot's to buy a car because we knew it wasn't going to hold up to make the trip back to Arizona. Charlie only had one car. They were hard to get during the war. And that car was a 12-cylinder Lincoln Zephyr that had belonged to Julia Bruce's brother, Fred Harrison. Gas rationing was on, but we had to have a car. So we paid $306 for that car. We made 4 trips back and forth to Illinois in it. We lived up at Rantoul for a while. When we started home, when he was discharged, the transmission went out of it, but we kept that car even for a year or so afterwards. But when he started to work, and some of you will remember Lauren Rawls, you all remember Lauren? He was working for Charlie then at the time. And you remember Truman came to Herrin,
Right.
President Truman, in 1948?
Right.
Well, they were all going to go up and see him, and Lord Rawls was working under a car underneath it, and it fell and broke his nose, and Leon had to take him to the hospital, so they didn't even get to, he said he'd always remember that. Anyway, I got to tell you about the rest of this car. Charlie didn't know what to do with it because it wasn't really worth much. The door panels were kind of broken. We had hauled another couple and their baby and another man part of the way. You know, you did a lot of things during the war that you wouldn't do otherwise. But he decided to junk it. So he called Samples Junk over at Meriden. They came and picked it up and started to take it off, and the transmission went out of it. The rear end, I believe that's what it is. Is that what it's called? I don't know. But anyway, we were glad we got to hear it, and somebody was really looking over it. But then he worked for Charlie after they moved up to in town, where you worked, and that's where that picture was taken that I have of him. And then he went with Eddie Carr for about 2.5 years. And in 1954, he got out of the car business and he hasn't been back in it since. He was glad to kind of kiss him goodbye, I think.
Thank you, Linda. Well, I think we'll just go down this road. Just raise your hand if you'd like to say a memory. I know Kenny Jarvis has a real interesting thing that he brought that I didn't know what it was, but we can just begin. Jim Peach, you have something you'd like to say about car dealers?
What?
Do you have something you'd like to say about the car dealers, or we can go on to Sam?
I'll just listen from
Okay. Sam, another memory?
I've lived here all my life too, and I know all these, every one of the dealers, just about. Of course, I knew Car Motors, or next door neighbors to our lumber yard they were 416 North Park, we were 420. And George Ward was on the other end, who was the auto parts supply. Nobody's mentioned that, but he was, I don't know if he was the only parts guy besides the dealers that had parts, car parts in town, was George Ward Auto.
Kimmel's was in business.
They had come over, but George had been there before the war, a long
Yeah.
time. But he had that, he lived upstairs and had the business below, and I think Joe
Was that the
White.
big building that was finally just destroyed
Yeah, on
next
brick
to the
building
city
on the
hall?
corner.
That was full of wonderful stuff.
Yeah, well, Joe White worked in the
It's
back
gone.
half of that as a mechanic. He and Eddie worked in the back half of that car parts dealership. Eddie had the one next door, and they bought a lot. It was right between the lumberyards, 50-foot lots there, or 25-foot lots. And he bought that and made it wider. And of course, Eddie, we bought a Chrysler in 1941, just before the war started. And that summer, and Bob Carr, it was Eddie's father, had Carr Drugs right next to Branson Pool Hall down there forever.
Yeah.
And we went to my mother and I, and my mother and I, and Mr. Carr, Bob Carr, we went up to pick that car up in St. Louis. Well, on the way home, it was a beautiful dark blue Chrysler, and it had a blue, like a velvet, the seats were covered in a blue soft nap on inside. It was a very beautiful car. On the way home, Bob Carr was driving. I was about 13, I think, there. So Bob says, "Come over, you want to drive this car?" We were on the highway going home. I said, "Well, yeah." She said, "Come over and sit in my lap." So we drove back. I drove that car on my mother about to go crazy, you know, on the highway. That's what he was. And so I drove that car a little, and that kept that car till about 1948. Of course, we got it just before the war started. You couldn't buy anything after that. But Carl, let's see, Nielsen worked there. That's the older brother. And Lester, a lot of you knew Lester Nielsen worked with Barney Bourne over at the county courthouse forever.
But he worked for Brewster for a long time.
He worked for Brewster too. Both
And had his own used car lot before he went to work there.
Didn't his brother Paul work at cars?
He worked for-
Paul worked at Cars,
Yeah.
his next brother Jim was at Norge, and then Doug was, worked for Brewster, and then after Brewster, he opened up a
Yep.
used car lot,
Just right down the street,
yeah.
From
And
Brewster's.
then he went to work for Barney Bourne.
right.
Yeah, they all worked there, and then we bought a 1948 pickup truck, Plymouth pickup truck there. Before, in the lumber business, we had the Mannings. Old man Manning and his boy Cletus had a truck, and they hauled all the lumber. If you wanted to get your lumber hauled, if you didn't haul it yourself, they were teamsters, and they would come. I've loaded many loads of sand and rock on his truck out of the back pile there. And but Mo, I can't think of his last name right now, I'm sort of blank. Bill Moffey washed the cars. He was always in the alley back there washing cars. So he was there forever, I think. I can't remember, but he always worked out in the back and washed those. So it was
I'm going
good
to jump
time.
these two right now because you did speak and we'll come back to you if you have something. Marilyn, do you have something?
I don't remember the car dealerships, but when we first moved here in '73, my two boys came down to live with me, and they would go across the street from the police station now to this car parts, and they'd come home with dirty noses and hands from looking in that window. I don't know who owned that or anything, but they thought that was just a gold.
Would that be Blankenship's?
No, that was,
No, it was the house we were talking
Oh,
about.
it's the one that you.
It's the city hall, exactly. It's right on Park Avenue.
that's,
Yeah, I don't know
That's
who it
what
was.
we're talking about.
Yeah, it's one-
What was that, Sam? What was the
Right after he
name?
got
but
What she's
George
talking
kept
about?
it clean. Charlie,
I bet it's Joe.
it never got cleaned after Charlie got it.
he
It just-
didn't.
Charlie who?
Charlie White.
Is that who has got
Joe White's son, yeah.
scrunchy?
I just said it.
He's the one that ended up with the auto parts store.
George Ward. George Ward.
George Ward had it.
Had
Had
it,
it.
right.
And when they sold that, Bob's brother, White, bought that, ran it. He stayed in there for about 3 years, I think. And they finally auctioned that stuff over something, and they sold everything.
Everything that was in there.
You can get 1928 fenders in there.
Pretty good. All right, Kenny Jarvis has brought something really interesting. Show him and see, surely somebody will know. Brewster or Parsons or Bill James.
I'm Kenny Jarvis and old Bill James, if I can get his attention there.
Bill, you don't.
I bought cars off him in '60s when he worked down at Clonches off of Dog Grove. I can remember Dog Grove sitting out there with what you's ashamed to sell to anybody else. And I'd come in, I'd buy a car off of him and fix it up and then sell it. And I bought cars off of you, Bill, cheap, and drove them home cheaper than I can buy a battery for what I
Yeah.
Right.
Goes in scrap, and it didn't weigh much.
And this morning, I drove a 1936 Chevy Business Coupe, which I bought back in November, and the weather's been bad and hadn't had a lot of time to get to play with it. But this morning, It's kinda cold in that old building, but I looked at that thing and I wonder if your old rascal start. Hadn't started since, well, 1st of December. That old 6-volt battery, if you guys remember them, they were, you know, turned over, fired up, and I drove her this morning.
Very good.
And I still play with old cars. When I read Cheryl's article in there, that caught my attention. That's why I come down here, because there's nobody in Herrin likes old cars more than me. And I can remember shopping at Claunches. I can remember going to Bedino Buick, couldn't trade with them. Couldn't trade Ford Garage, I couldn't trade nickels with them guys. And I went to Davis Motors, the showroom was upstairs.
Yep.
At Marlin, or Brian's Furniture now.
Right.
Went up there, and Oakley Hayes, I used to trade with Hayes. I don't know why I never could trade with Brewster. I ended up being a General Motors guy, and I think I just had a mental block against Fords, you know? And then I bought a Mustang back in '79. I just gave it to one of my daughters. It only rained on it once since 1980. It's been protected, but I restored it. And I bought this old Chevy at an estate sale back in November, and it's a nice car, but it had something in it that I thought I knew all about cars, and I didn't know what the heck it was. So I brought it up here. I figured out what it was after I got on the internet. I thought I knew what it was, but I didn't. Bill, I want you to look at that. See if you can tell me, do you remember that?
What do you say, Uncle Rudolph?
You old car man, you already know that.
It's a lock on setup, probably it's a lock on a spare tire. That's
You're absolutely right.
Hey!
Lock on spare tire.
Outside storage.
You got special lug nuts that fits over, not a regular lug nut.
right.
Back when we had the spare, this got spare tire mounted on the back end of it.
Yeah.
People stole them.
They wouldn't do that.
Yep.
Do you have any other words of wisdom about why you didn't drive for Mr. Rooster or Mr. Bedino?
What's that
I
now?
said, did you have any other words of wisdom about why you didn't buy from these various dealers?
I don't think so. I will tell you guys a story. You remember Oakley Hayes, I heard that name mentioned. My grandpa bought a brand new 41 Chevy. And Grandma never did drive one very much. And Oakley Hayes come to him in 1942. That's when cars worth a lot of money. Black market, remember that, guys? And Oakley bought that car off of Grandpa, and Grandpa walked to the coal mine. It was a mile down the road, you know. And he told him, he said, if you'll sell me that car after the war, whenever that is, I'll sell you the first car that comes in at the price it's supposed to be, not the black market price. As I can remember then, they were bringing about anywhere from $2,400 to $3,600 for a $1,000 car. But you could jump guys that had their name on the list. You remember that?
Yep.
And Oakley sold Grandpa a brand new Fleetline Chevy, 46 model, $960. Everybody else was giving way over $2,000 for it. And that started me when I got old enough to trading with them. Bill Gentry. You guys all remember Bill.
Yep.
I've sold Bill 2 cars for Nadine for his wife to drive, so I figured I'm pretty dang good salesman selling car selling a car. But one other thing, I bought something off the internet here the other day that I hadn't seen in years. I bought an A ration sticker. Let you buy 4 gallons of gas a week. You guys remember them? We had them in our
Yeah.
windshield.
Yep.
See, when I grew up in the 50s, them cars in the 30s, they were like new because they didn't get drove. During the war, they couldn't get gas, they couldn't get tires, couldn't get batteries. And I put an A ration sticker on this 36 Chevy. Got it on there. Found one on there, $5.
35-mile-an-hour speed limit.
Yeah,
during the war.
it says them on the back of that, don't drive over 35, save tires.
Right.
Thank
You
you.
couldn't get a tire, the tires was so doggone bad, you couldn't get one.
I did want to mention, because the name has been mentioned, we did send out an invitation to the HAHS family, and Dr. Bill Hayes, he said, you know, I'm just not the auto person. He said, I became a physician, and mentioned his brother Hank, who did work so long with Hayes Chevrolet. So the invitation was extended, and also to Ron Ward Chevrolet. And we're sorry that they couldn't be here with us. As we come down, what about the Mathis sisters? Do you have a car memory right here you'd like to share?
Well, I bought most of my cars from Mr. James, and I'm still driving the last one I bought.
You are too, Bill. We're still driving on one, last one we got from you.
Yep.
What about you, Billy? You have a,
I remember going with my sister. Her car had totally died, and our uncle was here from Michigan. We went and talked to Mr. James, and the two of them traded jokes back and forth the whole time they were dealing with this car. The uncle asked her if she was going to get the optional handles so she could use it as a coffin. Mr. James was laughing so hard he could hardly write up the contract.
what about you, Becky Boston? She's not a native, so.
Well, yes, actually, I grew up on a farm east of Carbondale, and we would come to Harper's feed store, which is up there, and always went by Brewster Ford, and then one day the sign was Lakeland Ford, and I always remember being impressed by the curved bricks and the curved windows and all of that. So that's my biggest memory of a car dealership in Herrin, my childhood.
While we have Becky on the stage, February 1st, she works at John A. Logan College in the library. She's an excellent researcher. And the next program on February 1st, which is a quarterly meeting, Becky has a wonderful program on the Herrin Massacre and the media interpretation of the massacre, not from Southern Illinois, but how it was in the New York Times and across the rest of the country. And I think we'll have a full house, because when we mention something about the massacre, I'm sure they all know. But Becky will be our presenter on February 1st.
And also, go ahead and mention about.
Yes, and Emmeline is going to give a program on February 22nd. She has a wonderful collection of the 1957 state champs, more than we even saw in September. So she'll be giving the program on February 22nd. So we'll continue. We have Attorney Brandon, who's on our board, Donald, and his wife, Kathy. What are your memories there?
Well, I'm gonna let the wife talk. She's a Brewster kid, so she's gonna start it out, and then I'll kick in if something she doesn't remember.
And she has a nice tie, a nice story.
Well, my father worked, Joe Conti worked for Brewster from 1945 probably until his death in 1975, so 30 years. I don't know what he started out doing, but I know he was a parts manager for most of my growing years. Yeah, and he drove the record. That was
pulled me out of the ditch.
Yeah. I wasn't going to tell any stories that he told about what he got you out of, and didn't tell your dad about.
Yep.
And that money that he made, the record money, he was able, I don't know what arrangement he had with Mr. Brewster, but the money he made from that was our vacation money and our DuPont State Fair money and so forth. A lot of stories, but one thing that I remember that made a big impression on me all the years that we were growing up, that we looked forward to every year, was the Brewster picnic out at Carterville. And Mr. Brewster did it up well. Remember Witt's Barbecue in Murfreesboro? Well, the men who cooked the barbecue, they came and they served and they chopped, and you had all the barbecues. The women brought side dishes, and I know my mom always baked Mr. Brewster a cherry pie, and somebody always made him fried chicken because I don't think he liked barbecue. And but he provided the ice cream and all the drinks, and we had all kinds of games and bingo, and he provided all the prizes. And we look forward to it every year. I think maybe one of the last ones that we went to, we might have already been married. I mean, we look forward to that, and that was a really big, big thing. And I had all those little cars too, and I let them get away from me. And I think they, you don't have them? I think they were a big item, and I don't think I got one every year because those were the models.
Well,
But I
mine
had
had
a
a metal for a while, and then they turned into plastic.
Yes.
And the plastic ones, the kids really.
I think my nephew might have destroyed, but they had every little detail on those. They were wonderful. And Mr. Brewster was very, very good to my father, especially the last year of his life. I know he paid him and he was sick. He didn't work.
That's a wonderful story. And Don, what about you and your,
Okay, couple stories. One is I got into the Brewster family to the back door by marrying Kathy, but I remember when we were either recently married or I was just in the process, I went to one of those famous picnics she's talking about, and we won a prize, and the prize was a big box of toilet paper. Sure was. Another was,
That's a pretty good gift.
two stories, I guess. One is the Jim Feezer story. You know, Jimmy was a smooth talker. He would come out to Sunnyside where my folks lived, and he'd have a car, and he'd just insist that it had to be driven. He'd say, now Pat, my dad's nickname is Pat, I'm going to leave this car out here, and you and Mabel drive it, and then I'll come back and get it. And that was one of his ploys. And my dad he didn't like that sales approach. He said, now Feezer, you can leave that car out there all day. I'm not going to drive that car, buddy. And then he'd say, Mabel, honey, would you drive that car? Well, my mother would say, Jimmy, I'm not your honey. But you know, you all know Feezers. The other is a Clonch Motor story. Terry Jones worked for Clonch Motors, and Terry Jones was a good friend of my family. So I needed a car when I came back to town and went down to see Terry. And Terry knew that he could get a car to suit me, and he was going to get a Chrysler. And he had Bill James pick it up in St. Louis. And he bought me a fine LHS, I think it was, used it for quite a few years. And then I passed it down to the bride, and she used it. And we wore the tires off of it, but those are my stories of the dealerships. Thank you.
thanks, Helen. Gail has just returned to Southern Illinois. She's is retiring here now, so she remembers, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, but I had two questions. Mary, where was the Owen, was it, you said across from Brewster's, the Owen dealership?
It was where.
Where Park Avenue is, motel?
Yes, it was where
there?
the motel's at now.
Okay.
And I think Paul had a dealership, but I couldn't remember, because
Okay.
I kept thinking.
Because I don't remember
Spezia
that
had,
at all, but.
I don't
Nash.
know.
So I couldn't remember what space out to Nash.
And my other question was, how long was Davis Motor in operation? I mean, how long were the doors open at Davis Motors?
Davis Motors? Long time. From in the 30s up until,
So it didn't go back in the 20s?
well, yes, but I don't know if it was in Herrin or not. Were they open in Herrin in the 20s?
I think so, because I think my grandfather worked for them in the 20s.
They were open in Marion in the 20s at the Ford store. And Kenny, as I said, back when he's 16 years old, had the Ford store in Carterville. But I don't know just exactly when they opened up with
Here.
Chrysler and Herrin, or I say Chrysler, Dodge and Plymouth. They was definitely in the 30s, but I don't know about the 20s, but definitely in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s.
Was it, you said where the furniture store is now?
Yeah, where the furniture
Okay, that's
store
what I
is right now.
thought.
And there's a great picture of that shows Fredman Furniture and with the Davis above it.
Is it?
Gail,
Okay,
that
I'll
for
look.
French too.
Yeah, right there it is.
I was down at Brian Furniture about a year ago talking to that guy, and I said, is the old elevator still in here that used to raise the cars up to the second floor of that building?
Is it?
He said it's still there, it still works. You wanna ride it?
I'll be darned.
Oh, that's a,
But it says Davis Motors on
on
that
the
building.
building.
So evidently they built that building, or Davis Brothers, I believe it says.
All right, we have Tom Gorski back here.
I don't have too much, but I grew up at 117 West Herrin Street. It's a storage facility right now. But right in back of that, it was in back of Brewster Motors there. And we lived there up until I was in the 3rd grade. I went to 4th grade over at Southside. But anyway, I used to watch them offload new cars off the car haulers at Brewster's there. And I didn't know any specific thing about cars then, but it was just fascinating to watch these guys unload these cars off the upper deck of the car haulers and whatnot. And something else, you got to talk about the Nash Garage. My dad worked at the coal mines, and he come in one evening and woke us up. He was working afternoon shift. It was 11, 12 at night, 1 a.m. or something like that, and it was burning. And he got me and my mom up, and we walked down to the corner down there on the corner of Brewster's, and we watched that garage burn. And I don't remember any specifics, but every now and then one of the gas tanks would explode off of it, one of the cars. And I remember the big fire and the explosions in the gas tanks. And when it come to buying new cars, my family had a connection with Bedinos down there. And we bought several new cars, several used cars off of them. And I remember the laid-back place, John. I don't remember any salesman there. I remember John Bedino. I remember the parts man, Gene Grout, and I remember the mechanic, Charlie, and I think he had an assistant. And those were the only 4 people I remember seeing.
I didn't have any salesman, he sold his own.
That's why I remember my dad going in there dealing with him from time to time. And you know, it was, like I say, it wasn't a business atmosphere, it was a...
Cheryl had written here that when she asked Benino what percentage of his business were repeat customers, he came up with a whopping 75%. He had customers that made a yearly trip from St. Louis to buy their Buicks from him. And then if you remember Buck and Carly McNeil, do you remember the McNeils?
Oh, yeah.
One year, they bought a car for each of their kids, and for them, and his wife, 5 Buicks.
Well, Bedino and Parson were similar, weren't they, Vi? I mean, they weren't big dealerships, but the owner did most of the business for them.
Most of the dealerships back then was on an allotment from the factories. Now, if you can sell them, you can get them. There's sure no problem to them.
We didn't talk about that. Everybody usually had 1 or 2 cars on display, and that's you had to order.
With Pontiac back in the 50s there and into the 60s, you was on an allotment, and if you had a pretty strong dealership, which there was 4 of us here in southern Illinois did, was old Pontiac, Herrin, Carpendale, West Frankfort, and Marion. Our allotment was 8 cars a month. That's it. Now, they were distributorships in that they operated through, and you could get more cars, but in order to do so, you had to get it from one of the big boys in St. Louis and drive to St. Louis, get the car and drive it back, which we did a whole bunch of. When they closed out Pontiac in 1961, at the end of the year there, that meant there would be no Pontiac dealership in Herrin, so the dealers in Carpendale, West Frankfort, and Marion was expected to take up the slack and cover Herrin. They didn't want to go to the trouble to do it. So each of them gave Clonch Motors 2 of the new Pontiacs. They had 6 in Carpendale, 6 in West Frankfort, 6 in Marion, and we had 6 at Clonch Motors. And we bootlegged Pontiacs for 2 years before we got the Dodge franchise in '63.
Well, we're getting close to the 4 o'clock hour, at least a quarter till. This has been excellent. I hope each of you have enjoyed this. We can hang out. Certainly, we have some refreshments over here. If you'd like to stay, look at the pictures. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. Certainly, thank our owners and the workers, the staff members. I did ask Gail, who always works at our, I said, would you like to say something? She said, Sharon, I don't own a car and I don't drive a car. So that's a pretty good rarity. Philip?
I want to mention on the last table over here are some Saga magazines, and if there's something in there that has your interest, you're welcome to have one. So make sure you look through that. Look at the displays that are up here. Don't forget you can order some from right in this area here from French's.
Phil, give us a plug on this association we have here. You know, just about everybody in Herrin ought to be a member of the Herrin Historic Society here. And we have some wonderful programs, and we're trying to do another job to get this thing built up bigger. What is our cost?
It's our memberships are $25 for a single, $35 for a couple or family, and there's some brochures at the sign-in table back there by the poinsettia. If you'd be interested, take one, or if you know somebody who would like to join. Now, for that, it only covers the newsletter cost, and we have one each month. 12 months, we've had a long series of all the different schools that have been in Herrin, and then this last one, was it the last one about Holy Sunday? About the revivals thing. So it's different things like that, and I'll show you an example.
Great-grandfather.
Like right here, we had our Christmas program last night. Usually we have the front cover tells about the program we just had, and about the new programs coming up. And this is the one that just came out. You should have just received it yesterday. It got reworked, so it came out kind of late. Here's one from November, but sometimes there'll be some old photos about schools and whatnot. But your membership covers to the penny just the mailings and the newsletters. So there's nothing left over. We run mostly off of the donations and whatnot. But we would like to invite anyone to join, and our lecture series are free. Anyone can come to them, and we try to have one or two every month, and we've been doing this for 3 years now, and they really work out. We've also been giving over the miners wall memorial to kind of keep that up, and we're doing that as well as the Stotler Herrin Cemetery, and if you've been by there on 12th Street, it's been all cleaned out, and we're hoping to, at some point later on, being able to get enough money to put up a memorial there with the names of everybody that was in there for some of the stones that are starting to break and disappear. And we just invite everyone, and we want to thank everyone for coming out. Cheryl, do you have anything else?
We'll keep you posted in the newspapers about the next meeting. Sam has an excellent idea. We should all be evangelists and ambassadors for this group because it's such fun and it's so a feel-good afternoon, I think, when we come and we share our memories and we have these various programs.
When someone talks about something, it sparks a memory from somebody else. We found that out at our last meeting. And one time we did a meeting like today about the downtown businesses. So many people come up with something that was new. No one knew about it or had heard about it, because it was just a personal experience. And that's why these are great meetings.
I'm sure my mom thought cars. He ever brought
Close here. My wife I worked 4 years. We were right in
You want me to drop
He was just opened up, and I didn't